Several people who heard my Independence Day address have criticized me for pointing only to problems rather than offering solutions. That, of course, is a valid point, a valid criticism. So in the next half an hour, I'm going to talk about the broad scope of our national economic and fiscal problems. That is to say, how government manages its revenue and its expenditure, and look at how we could get out of the mess in which we find ourselves now. But we need to understand at the very outset that there are no quick or easy remedies to our national illness. A complete cure will take some decades, there's simply no escaping that. But I believe that with a little patience and diligence, it can be done. The biggest problems we will face will come from a frustrated electorate that demands quick and easy answers and is not willing to stay the course. And of course, the politicians who promise simplistic solutions. All right, so let's look at some numbers, because remember, numbers do not lie. This year's budget is probably as good a place to start as any. We're going to be discussing some big numbers, so make sure you understand exactly what a trillion is. It's a million. 1 followed by 12 zeros. You need to bear in mind also that this is a broad brush discussion. In the interest of time, I'm going to be glossing over a lot of detail. But by the end of it, I hope you'll be thinking new thoughts about the way forward for our country. The Treasury estimates that a total government expenditure will be incurred this year of around 7.9 trillion rupees. I'm going to be rounding these numbers down for simplicity. While total government revenue from taxes, duties and so on will be around just 3.4 million rupees. That's not unusual. That's a normal year in the economic life of Sri Lanka. So that means that there's a shortfall, a deficit of 4.5 trillion, which can be met only by borrowing. There's no money to be had from anywhere else. In other words, the government spends much more than it earns. This has been the case ever since I was born in 1955. I've got used to it. I guess we all have. When these debts are in foreign exchange, we have to earn foreign exchange to pay them back. That's always difficult, which is why the mountains of international debt keep growing. But when it's in rupees from local banks and bondholders, for example, the government usually takes new loans to pay off the old loans. It just prints more rupees and pays these off. This results in both inflation and devaluation. It's why the rupee has depreciated, by 11,000% against the US dollar since independence. So let's have a look at where all this money goes. Here's a rough breakdown of the 10 biggest areas of government expenditure. You can see straight away that a whopping 43.6% goes to service our existing debt. Of that, around 2 trillion rupees are for paying back local debt. But those old loans can be paid off simply by taking new loans, so we can forget about that 2 trillion. Now we are left with the 9 biggest areas of government expenditure. These account for almost 80% of the budget. The balance 20% goes on things we can't really do very much about, like law enforcement, justice, the environment, foreign affairs, fisheries, sports, labor, irrigation, I don't know, stuff like that. The 9 that are now on the screen are the ones really worth worrying about, the big ones. So now the question is, if we want to reduce the deficit, if we want, in other words, to reduce our national debt, where can we make cuts? You can see that interest on our debt accounts to more than a third of our expenditure. But there's really not much we can do about that. As you run your eye down the list, you'll see that there really isn't anything you can really cut anywhere. So the challenge before us is to see where we can reduce waste, the wastage of government resources. Many people see loss-making state-owned enterprises, for example, as the place where most government money is wasted. Sri Lankan Airlines, for example, makes a loss of between 1 and 2 billion rupees every week of the year. Its accumulated losses over the past decade are well over $1 billion. This is effectively a subsidy paid by poor citizens, who in many cases haven't been inside a plane, to help finance people to travel Sri Lanka. It's crazy. Worst of all, these losses don't even make it into the budget. They're hidden away as unpaid loans given by state banks to Sri Lankan, or as sovereign guarantees issued by the Treasury, and so on. They don't make it into public consciousness. But let's get back to government expenditure. One tends to hear people say that if only we could reduce waste, things would not be so bad. Well, here are 5 projects that almost everyone agrees were a complete waste of government funds, of government resources. The Mattala Airport, the Hambantota Port, the 96 kilometers of expressway from Mathura to Mattala, which carries very little traffic, the International Convention Centre at Hambantota, and of course, Nelumkolana. You often hear opposition politicians citing these projects as examples of extravagant waste of public funds. And I agree. They do almost nothing for our economy. But let's add up their cost. As you can see, it tots up to about 3.6 billion, 1.3 trillion rupees. Now look at that figure in the context of just this year's budget deficit of 2.4 trillion rupees. You can see that even all these massive projects, extravagant, wasteful projects, account for only about half of this year's deficit. As wasteful as they were, their impact on our national budget is at best, well, modest. But the idea that our problems stem from waste persist in the public imagination, as we saw just a couple of weeks ago with the Independence Day celebrations. So let's dig a bit deeper into what this waste is about. Well, first off, we need to remember that all government departments, all institutions, all people, you and I, are wasteful to varying degrees. You can only reduce waste, you can never eliminate it. So rather than trying to pinpoint waste, let's say we might be able, as a result of a massive anti-waste campaign, to bring total government expenditure down by 10%, from 5.8 trillion rupees to 5.2 trillion. Would that help the deficit? Well, yes, but only marginally. Then let's say we went the whole hog and slashed corruption by another 10%, say. Now, after all this effort, the deficit falls to 1.3 trillion. So if we succeeded, a massive task, if we succeeded in reducing waste and corruption each by 10%, we still have a massive budget deficit. That's still a big number. But we need to remember that salaries account for most of government expenditure. So with respect to this big chunk of the budget, there's precious little room for corruption, and there's nothing we can do to make savings by eliminating waste and corruption. We have to keep paying people their salaries. So it becomes clear that the only way back to prosperity is not just to eliminate waste and corruption, but also to increase government revenue, increase the money that government earns from taxes, duties, and so on. But taxes and duties depend entirely on the nation's prosperity. A prosperous nation pays a lot more in tax than a poor nation. This year, Ranil Wickremesinghe widened the income tax net and more than doubled tax rates, hoping to raise revenue threefold, from about 300 billion rupees in 2021 to about 900 billion in income tax revenue this year. But of course, that simply ain't gonna happen, because in the meantime, the economy has contracted, it has shrunk drastically. And so many companies are now unprofitable, and many people are out of work. And because of inflation, our cost of living has doubled, while our income has remained static. So you can see that imposing higher taxes doesn't really work. People have no money left with which to pay taxes. And I think you'll have seen the solution by now. We simply have to grow the economy while keeping tax rates low enough to encourage people to actually pay their taxes, to be able to pay. So let's assume that we manage to grow the economy at the rate of about 6% per year, year after year, for the next several years. Whatever politicians might tell you, 6% is about the maximum we can realistically hope for on a sustained basis. We might have better years, but we certainly will have worse years as well. But meanwhile, we mustn't forget that by then, we'll also have to start paying off the mountain of accumulated foreign debt we have, together with accrued interest. Our creditors will probably discount our debt, take a haircut of 20 or 30%, and also give us a grace period of a couple of years, a moratorium. But then we'll have to start servicing our debt at the rate of about 4.5% of GDP every year. That's about $4 or $5 billion per year. So let's be realistic and factor that into our accounts as well. Well, a little simple arithmetic shows you that it'll take about 15 years for our economy to grow enough to eliminate the deficit, the current deficit, the annual current deficit. But hang on, in those 15 years, we'll be running a deficit every year, and that means accumulating even more debt. This January alone, the government borrowed 368 billion rupees from local lenders. This goes on month after month. What's more, our expenditure won't remain static. Costs go up all the time because of inflation, devaluation, for example. So the sad truth is that an economic recovery isn't realistic even in 15 years, probably not even 25 or 30 years. That's why I say this is a generational problem. Regardless of how hard we try, regardless of how well and how much we innovate, it will take a generation. So whether you vote for Sajid or Anura Kumara or Ranil or someone else as the next president, you must understand that the next government or even the next few governments will not succeed in solving this crisis. But that isn't to say that we shouldn't do everything we can to speed things along. Of course we should. We should slash waste. We should cut corruption. And we must make government and the economy by and large as efficient as we can. We can emerge from this mess only through hard work, through discipline, through efficiency, and through increased productivity. There are no shortcuts, except perhaps for selling off some state assets to help improve the government's liquidity position. But even selling all the family silver, assuming that the unions will let you, is unlikely to generate the money you need to offset even a third of our national debt. So basically, we need to reduce government expenditure. There's really no alternative, but this involves some really hard choices. For example, we need to rethink the real value of free education in the background that 60% of our children don't even get as far as A-levels, and of those who do, more than a third fail. Even for the ones that pass, education is hardly free. We all know that. It depends largely on their parents' ability to afford private tuition. Often enough, I meet successful, educated people who tell me, I am a success only because of free education. Yes, of course you are. But our concern isn't so much about the tiny fraction of people like you who are successes. It's about the vast majority of people who fail. What is the value of free education when more than 70% of children finish their school careers as failures, condemning many of them to lifetimes of failure, lifetimes of underperformance, of underachievement? Can we really afford to provide universal free healthcare, a network of more than 600 hospitals and clinics, almost 90,000 hospital beds? Or should we just focus on free primary healthcare, preventive healthcare, with free curative services only for young people, the next generation in which we have so much hope, with perhaps narrow exceptions for older people who are in real distress? I worked in the Ministry of Health myself for many years, and I know just how valuable free universal healthcare is. But we need to think how it can be paid for, how it can be afforded. And now that I'm on a roll, let's cut a bit closer to the bone. Can we really afford to have a 300,000-man national defense force? Do we dare eliminate waste also in the armed forces? Do the armed forces really need so many private golf courses, more than 24 hotels, all these restaurants, 1,000 staff cars for officers and their families? I know I'm treading on corns here, but I want to be clear that I believe in a strong, respected military. I don't mean to show off, but I'm perhaps one of the handful of civilians in Sri Lanka who have received a military medal for my services as a civilian to the armed forces. I mention this to emphasize that I'm not against a strong defense force, but when we review the general philosophy of Sri Lanka, we must all be ready to make sacrifices. Government institutions, for example, own more than 400 so-called circuit bungalows. Whatever for? These may have made sense in the colonial era when there were no hotels, but that's no longer the case. We shouldn't be like a man who's chained himself to the railway track and then asks everyone else for solutions. I can hear some of you saying, but things aren't so bad now. There are no petrol queues, there are no gas queues, the exchange rate has been stable during the past 6 months, and so on. Sadly, that is an illusion. The reason that things seem to be better now than they were a year ago is because we are no longer repaying our debts. On the 12th of April last year, we stopped paying back our creditors. It's like the situation you'd be if you maxed out your credit card and then refused to pay the bill. For a short time, you'd be very happy. But then the credit card company takes you to court and the court can force you to pay or declare yourself bankrupt. Worse still, no one will ever lend you money again. We also hear various politicians saying that the IMF is causing us a lot of harm. That, of course, is a load of nonsense. There's only one thing the IMF really says we must do, and that is that we must be responsible. All the IMF wants us to do is to balance our budget. They want us not to spend more money than we earn, to keep our debt below our gross domestic product, to below 95% of GDP. It's now running well over 115% of GDP and has become unsustainable. If you think all this is bad advice, there's really no point in your listening to this talk. Our real problem is that we demand more and more free services from the government, and to give us these services, successive governments have, ever since independence, been forced to borrow more and more from the international community. Because of this, ever since independence, we've been living well beyond our means. We citizens are the problem. You and I are the problem. If we continue borrowing money, we're only creating a mountain of debt for our children to pay back. We simply cannot spend more than we earn. There's a word for people who do that. They're called losers. Now let's look at solutions. How can we reduce wastage? Most of you would probably say we should eliminate corruption. I agree with that. It's important. But while the present laws are good enough, the judicial process is simply too slow. Maybe we need to establish special courts for cases of bribery or corruption. But the present Bribery and Corruption Commission is not dynamic because it depends on the police and the Attorney General's Department, which lack the skilled manpower and very often are subject to political interference. And so the resources to prosecute such cases seems to be absent. We need to establish a special prosecutor's office, an independent corruption investigation unit with police powers but outside the police. We've done this already very successfully, for example, with the Special Task Force, so we know it can be done. There's also another aspect of wastage, which is money given by the government to prop up loss-making enterprises like Sri Lankan Airlines. Of course, there'll be politicians who tell you, but we can make these enterprises profitable. Well, politicians have been telling you this, telling you such lies for 75 years now. If these loss-making enterprises can't be privatized, they must simply be closed down. The sooner we cut our losses, the better. And we need to work tirelessly to eliminate waste. For example, ministers should have only one official vehicle each. I remember that both J.R. Jayawardena and Ranasinghe Premadasa never had escort vehicles, backup vehicles, and so on. They had a security officer sitting in the front seat of their car. That was all. I remember one day when I was an official in the health ministry, our minister, Dr. Ranjit Athapattu, had a heart attack. He didn't even have a driver for his car. He just got in his car and drove himself to the National Hospital. Those were the kinds of ministers Sri Lanka used to have back then in the 1980s and 90s. Unlike the lotus eaters and parasites that blight our country nowadays. The biggest challenge of all is to increase efficiency throughout the country. Until recently, we were able to issue a passport or a national identity card on the same day. That's remarkable. We can still get a copy of a birth, a death, or a marriage certificate from the Registrar General within an hour or so. Fantastically efficient. With good leadership, our government institutions can provide a fantastic level of service, and they do. But many government institutions, many government offices are not so efficient. To register a company takes weeks, to register a patent takes years, and to close down a company is simply impossible. We need a good bankruptcy law, like the so-called Chapter 11 Code of the United States. Efficient bankruptcy is something that is integral to a thriving economy, and as we're seeing in the case of Sri Lanka, to a thriving country. And then, every government office that deals with the public must perform to published targets, to published norms, to open a tax file, same day, to renew a license, same day, to be seen by a doctor at an outpatient clinic, 30 minutes, and so on. Every service that can be obtained online should be online. That's already happening. Penalties should be imposed on institutions that don't perform to their targets. They should publish targets and be held to them. And an ombudsman must be appointed to every institution so that public complaints about efficiency, corruption, or any grievance can be investigated and corrected independently. Such ombudsmen must work as volunteers, free of charge. People like retired judges, senior public servants, or corporate leaders. People like me, for goodness sake. In fact, I myself have served in such a capacity, and believe me, it works. You can really make a difference. Most of all, we have to do everything we can to make the private sector more efficient and more productive. Last year, we had 28 public holidays in Sri Lanka. Even when the Queen of England died, we declared a national holiday. A bizarre instance of the hostage syndrome, where the oppressed mourn the death of their oppressor. In addition to that, every employee gets 21 days of paid vacation, casual, sick leave. This means that the country is on holiday for more than 150 days of the year. We need to remember that the most important driver of economic growth, the driver of prosperity, is work, not holidays. We simply cannot afford to have national holidays on every full moon day. We need to reduce this to the most important days for Buddhists, such as Vesak and Poson. Hindus, Muslims, and Christians each account for less than 15% of the population. They need to be content with one national holiday each, at best. And stupid laws, like not allowing tourist hotels to sell alcohol on public holidays, laws that inhibit economic development, need to be scrapped. We need to drive our economy, not our sanctimonious morality. You say you want Sri Lanka to be more like Singapore. In that case, like Singapore, have just 10 public holidays per year. Rise to that challenge. In Singapore, an employer can terminate the services of any employee with just 4 weeks' notice, at most. In America, you don't need to give notice at all. Yet, the unemployment rate in Singapore is less than 2%. Employers can dismiss underperforming employees, and when that happens, the whole country becomes more efficient. In Sri Lanka, the labour tribunal system protects inefficient and even corrupt workers. Inefficient employees need to be turfed out and replaced with efficient ones. There's no other remedy for the disease that afflicts our nation. We can never become a developed country by just wishing it, by dreaming about it. We have to do the things that developed countries do. As a nation, we need to recognize that we are still polarized on the lines of not just political ideology, but also of some kind of paranoia and xenophobia, a suspicion of the outside world. For 75 years now, we have sat on the Trincomalee oil tank farm complex, preventing it from being used, overinflating the strategic importance of these aging tanks. We'd rather that nobody use them. Various segments of our society don't want this complex falling into the hands of, I don't know, the Indians, the Chinese, the Americans, depending on their pet ideology. But just look at how Singapore manages the same challenges pragmatically. Hugely valuable dead assets, like the oil tank farm, are everywhere in Sri Lanka. Almost 10,000 inland tanks that are barely touched for aquaculture or even for tourism. Nobody will let you use them. Similarly, the vast tracts of unutilized state land, only 75,000 hectares of which are used even for forestry. People often say that they wish Sri Lanka were more like Singapore, but that's just loose talk, it's only fantasy. As soon as people realize that Singapore got to where it is through hard work, through sacrifice, and through putting efficiency and discipline and productivity ahead of all other considerations, not least tradition and religion, then they quickly lose interest. They aren't up for it. So I hope I've convinced you that there's no quick fix for Sri Lanka. But with 20 or 30 years of diligence, there is yet a chance that we can make our way out of being a failed state. You might ask, do I really believe that we have it in us to rise to that challenge, to be the generation that reversed our nation's post-independence malaise? Nah. But hang on a minute. It seems that Bill Gates has just died and left $50 billion to pay off Sri Lankan debt. Yay! Our troubles are over. Dream on, my friends. Until next time.